Today's case takes us into the glamorous yet dangerous world of 1920s London society, where a camera's flash illuminates more than just a photograph. But before we dive into this intriguing mystery, let me ask you this. What if I told you that a camera flash could solve a murder, that the very moment of death could be captured forever, revealing secrets that the killer never intended to share? Keep that question in mind as we explore the photographer's last shot. My name is Inspector William Hartley, and in my 35 years of investigating London's most perplexing crimes, I've learned that truth often hides in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it's found in a footprint in the mud, sometimes in a fiber caught on a windowsill, and sometimes in the dying words of a victim who manages to leave one final clue. But in October of 1925, truth revealed itself in the split second of a camera flash, captured forever in silver and light, in a way that would challenge everything I thought I knew about impossible crimes. What if I told you that a camera flash could solve a murder, that the very moment of death, captured in silver and light, could reveal not just the killer's identity, but the impossible method they used to commit the perfect crime? In the autumn of 1925, that's exactly what happened in the most exclusive photography studio in Mayfair, where society's secrets were developed in darkness, and death came calling with a camera of its own. The fog had settled thick over London that October night, rolling in from the Thames like a living thing, muffling the sounds of the city, and turning the gas lamps into ghostly halos of amber light. It was the kind of fog that made honest citizens hurry home, and gave criminals the cover they needed for their darkest work. The kind of night when secrets could be buried as deeply as bodies, and when the powerful could move through the shadows without fear of recognition. I had been reviewing case files in my study at my modest flat in Bloomsbury, a glass of whiskey at my elbow, and the comforting weight of my service revolver in its holster, a habit I'd maintained since my early days walking the beat in Whitechapel. Outside, I could hear the muffled clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, and the occasional rumble of a motor car feeling its way carefully through the murk. London was transforming itself in those days, caught between the horse-drawn past and the motorized future, and nights like this reminded you that some things, fog, crime, and human nature, remained stubbornly unchanged. The telephone rang with its shrill, insistent cry at exactly 1:47 a.m. I noted the time because punctuality had become a professional obsession after decades of investigating crimes, where minutes could mean the difference between catching a killer and watching them slip away into the anonymous darkness of the city. Inspector Hartley. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, tinged with the kind of upper-class accent that suggested expensive education and even more expensive problems. "This is Superintendent Morrison. I need you at 47 Berkeley Square immediately. We have a situation that requires your particular expertise with unconventional cases." Berkeley Square. Even through the fog, I could picture it perfectly. One of London's most fashionable addresses, where the wealthy and powerful maintained their elegant Georgian townhouses, and conducted their business well away from the prying eyes of the common folk. Whatever had happened there would undoubtedly involve people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages, people with enough influence to demand Scotland Yard's finest detective in the middle of the night, and enough secrets to make that demand necessary. I dressed quickly in my best suit. Experience had taught me that dealing with the upper classes required a certain attention to appearance, and made my way through the fog-shrouded streets. The journey took nearly an hour, my driver navigating by instinct and memory, rather than sight, the familiar landmarks of London reduced to vague shapes and distant sounds in the grey murk. Big Ben chimed the hours invisibly. The Thames flowed unseen but audible through the occasional calls of foghorns from barges, feeling their way through the darkness. When we finally reached Berkeley Square, I could see the warm glow of electric lights spilling from the windows of number 47, cutting through the fog like a beacon calling ships to safety. But I knew from experience that what waited inside would be anything but safe. Police constables stood at attention despite the late hour, their brass buttons gleaming in the gaslight, their faces grim with the particular solemnity that comes with serious crime. The building itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, 5 stories of honey-colored stone that spoke of old money and established power. But it wasn't a private residence that had summoned me here. The discreet brass plaque beside the front door read R. Blackwood, Society Photographer, by appointment only. Reginald Blackwood. Even I, with my deliberately limited interest in London's social scene, recognized the name. For the past decade, Blackwood had been the most sought-after photographer in the city, the man who captured the elegant poses and studied spontaneity that graced the pages of Tatler and Vogue. His studio was where debutantes came to be immortalized before their presentation at court, where politicians arranged to have their portraits taken for election campaigns, where society hostesses gathered to plan elaborate charity galas that would cement their positions in the social hierarchy. But Blackwood's true power, and his true danger, lay not in the photographs he published but in those he didn't. His camera had witnessed indiscretions that could topple governments, recorded affairs that could end marriages worth millions, captured moments of weakness that could destroy reputations built over generations. In the glittering world of 1920s London society, Reginald Blackwood held more secrets than the confessional at Westminster Cathedral, and he had been considerably less discreet about keeping them. Think about this for a moment. What kind of man builds his fortune on other people's secrets? What drives someone to point a camera at the powerful and say, "Pay me, or I'll show the world who you really are"? As we'll discover, Reginald Blackwood was about to learn that some secrets fight back. Sergeant Mills met me at the entrance, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the gravity of whatever we were about to encounter. Mills had been my partner for nearly 8 years now, and his instincts had sharpened considerably during our time together. He was a working-class man from Manchester, the son of a factory foreman, but he possessed a natural intelligence and attention to detail that made him invaluable in complex investigations. If Mills looked troubled, the situation was undoubtedly serious and potentially dangerous. "Inspector," he said quietly, leading me through an elegant foyer decorated with enlarged photographs of London's most famous faces. "The victim is Reginald Blackwood himself, found dead in his dark room approximately 2 hours ago by his assistant, Miss Sarah Hartwell. She came in to develop some photographs from this evening's shoot and discovered the body." We climbed a curved staircase, lined with more photographs, cabinet ministers and their wives, leading actresses from the West End, young aristocrats in their military uniforms, society beauties in poses that suggested both innocence and a sophisticated knowledge of their own appeal. Each image was perfectly composed, lit with the expertise that had made Blackwood famous throughout European high society. But as we ascended toward his private studio, I couldn't help but notice that many of the subjects wore expressions that seemed somehow guarded, as if they were posing not just for the camera, but for posterity itself, knowing that this image might someday be used against them. "What was the cause of death?" I asked, as we reached the second-floor landing. "Single gunshot to the chest, sir. Dr. Morrison is with the body now, but his preliminary examination suggests death occurred between 11:30 and midnight. The wound appears to have been inflicted at close range. Powder burns suggest the shooter was no more than 6 feet away. Any signs of forced entry? Evidence of a struggle? None, sir," which suggests either that Mr. Blackwood knew his killer well enough to admit them willingly, or— Mills paused, his expression growing more puzzled. "Well, here's where it gets interesting, Inspector. We found something rather unusual at the scene." Mills stopped outside a heavy oak door marked Private Studio, no admittance, his hand resting on the brass handle. The door itself was impressive, solid English oak with brass fittings that spoke of both security and elegance. Whatever Blackwood had been protecting in his private studio, he'd spared no expense in ensuring it remained private. "The victim was found clutching his camera, sir, a Leica model, German-made and expensive. The flash powder had been discharged, and there was an exposed plate still in the camera when we arrived. But here's the peculiar part. According to Miss Hartwell, Mr. Blackwood was left-handed, yet we found the camera in his right hand. A photographer found dead with his camera in the wrong hand. A final photograph captured at the moment of his death. The implications were staggering. Not only did we have a murder to investigate, but we potentially had photographic evidence of the crime itself. But the detail about Blackwood's handedness suggested something more complex than a simple case of a dying man grasping for his camera. Has anyone spoken with Miss Hartwell in detail? Briefly, sir, but she's rather shaken by the evening's events. She's been waiting in the main studio to speak with you personally. Seems she has some concerns about irregularities in Mr. Blackwood's recent behavior. Irregularities. In my experience, when people used euphemisms like that, they were usually trying to avoid saying something that would implicate them in whatever crime had been committed. Miss Hartwell would bear careful questioning. The studio beyond the door was a testament to Blackwood's success and his obsession with his craft. The main room was enormous, taking up nearly half the building's second floor, with tall windows that would provide natural light during the day, and elaborate gas fixtures that could be adjusted to create the perfect artificial illumination for evening shoots. The space was filled with cameras of various sizes, from massive plate cameras capable of capturing the finest detail to smaller, more portable models for location work. But it was the photographs themselves that told the real story of Blackwood's business. The walls were lined with portraits of London's elite, but not the kind of formal posed images that would appear in society magazines. These were more intimate shots, politicians caught in unguarded moments, actresses between performances when their public masks had slipped, society hostesses in private conversation where their true personalities showed through. It was the work of a man who understood that power lay not just in capturing beauty, but in capturing truth. And in London's high society, truth was often the most dangerous commodity of all. But it was the dark room where the tragedy had occurred. Through an open door at the far end of the studio, I could see the distinctive red glow of a safety lamp, still burning after all these hours. The room beyond was cramped compared to the spacious studio, fitted with developing trays, chemical baths, and the specialized equipment necessary to transform exposed film into finished photographs. Dr. Morrison looked up as we entered, his face grave in the crimson light. He was a small, precise man who had served as police surgeon for nearly 20 years, and his expertise had proven invaluable in countless investigations. Morrison had seen enough violent death to remain calm under the most disturbing circumstances, but something about this scene had clearly unsettled him. "Inspector Hartley," he said, stepping aside to reveal the body, "I'm afraid this case presents several unusual aspects that you'll need to consider. The wound itself is straightforward enough, a single bullet to the chest, fired from close range. But the circumstances, well, they're decidedly peculiar." Reginald Blackwood lay sprawled across the dark room floor, a man of perhaps 55 years, whose elegant evening clothes were now stained with blood and developing chemicals. He had been a handsome man in life, with the kind of distinguished features that would have made him as comfortable in front of a camera as behind one. His dark hair was silver at the temples, and his hands, now pale and still, showed the characteristic stains that marked a man who worked daily with photographic chemicals. But it was what he held in those lifeless hands that captured my attention immediately. A camera, not one of the large studio models, but a smaller handheld device designed for quick, candid shots. The Leica that Mills had mentioned, held in the wrong hand for a left-handed man, positioned as if Blackwood had been trying to take a photograph at the moment of his death. The shot was fired at close range, Dr. Morrison continued, indicating the wound, probably no more than 6 feet, given the powder burns around the entry point. But here's what's particularly puzzling. The angle of the bullet suggests the shooter was standing directly in front of the victim, yet Mr. Blackwood appears to have been taking a photograph at the moment he was killed. I knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene, and examined the camera more closely. The Leica was indeed a precision instrument, the kind of expensive equipment that a professional photographer would use for his most important work. The film advance mechanism showed that a photograph had indeed been taken, the final photograph of Reginald Blackwood's career. But there was something else that caught my attention, something that Dr. Morrison had missed in his initial examination. The camera's leather grip showed signs of having been wiped clean, but there were still traces of what appeared to be a different person's fingerprints on the metal surfaces. Someone else had handled this camera after Blackwood's death. Here's what I want you to consider. If Blackwood was left-handed but found holding the camera in his right hand, and if someone else's fingerprints were on the camera, what does that tell us about the moments immediately after his death? Was someone trying to create evidence or destroy it?
Has anyone examined the photograph yet? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Mills shook his head. We thought it best to wait for you, sir. Miss Hartwell knows how to develop the plate properly, but we wanted to ensure proper chain of evidence. She's been quite insistent that the developing process must be done correctly. Says that Mr. Blackwood was particular about his photographic standards, even in death. Miss Sarah Hartwell. I had yet to meet Blackwood's assistant, though I had seen her name mentioned in various society publications as the young woman who managed the photographer's appointments and occasionally assisted with his more elaborate shoots. Finding the body must have been traumatic, but if she possessed the technical knowledge to develop the final photograph, her expertise would prove invaluable to our investigation. Where is Miss Hartwell now? In the main studio, sir. She's been waiting to speak with you, though she seems quite anxious about something beyond just discovering the body. She mentioned several times that there were things about tonight that weren't right. Her words exactly. I stood, surveying the dark room once more, before returning to the main studio. The space seemed different now, knowing that its master lay dead just yards away. The elegant photographs that lined the walls suddenly seemed less like art and more like evidence, each one a potential clue to understanding who might have wanted Reginald Blackwood dead, and why they had chosen this particular night to act. Sarah Hartwell sat in one of the ornate chairs that Blackwood used for portrait sessions, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her dark eyes reflecting the shock of her discovery. She was a woman of perhaps 27, with the kind of understated beauty that the camera would love, regular features, expressive eyes, and an air of intelligence that suggested she was more than merely decorative in Blackwood's organization. But there was something else in her expression, a wariness that suggested she knew more about her employer's business than she was initially willing to admit. Miss Hartwell, I said gently, settling into the chair across from her. I understand this has been a terrible shock, but I need to ask you some questions about what you discovered this evening. Take your time. I know this isn't easy. She nodded, her voice steady, despite the circumstances, though I noticed she kept glancing toward the dark room door, as if expecting Blackwood to emerge at any moment. Of course, Inspector, I want to help in any way I can. Mr. Blackwood he was more than just an employer. He was a mentor, a teacher. He gave me opportunities that no other photographer in London would have offered to a woman. Tell me about this evening. What brought you to the studio so late? We had a session earlier, a portrait sitting for Lady Pemberton and her daughter. Society photography. Nothing unusual on the surface, but Mr. Blackwood was experimenting with a new lighting technique, something he'd been working on for weeks. He was quite secretive about it. Actually, wouldn't let me assist directly, just observed from a distance. She paused, and I could see her carefully considering her next words. This was a woman who had learned to be cautious about what she revealed, probably from working closely with Blackwood and his dangerous secrets. He wanted me to develop the test shots tonight, so we could review them first thing in the morning. But there was something else, Inspector. Mr. Blackwood had been different lately, nervous, looking over his shoulder, checking the locks multiple times before leaving each evening. He'd been receiving telephone calls that seemed to upset him greatly. What sort of calls? He wouldn't say specifically, but I overheard parts of several conversations. Someone was making demands, threatening to expose certain aspects of his business if he didn't comply with their wishes. Mr. Blackwood seemed genuinely frightened, which was unusual for him. In all the years I've worked here, I've never seen him show fear of anyone or anything. This was significant. Blackwood had built his reputation and his fortune on being the man who held secrets over others, the photographer who could make or break social careers with a single image. If someone had managed to turn the tables on him to make him the victim of blackmail rather than its perpetrator, that would provide a powerful motive for murder. And when you arrived tonight, I have my own key, you understand. I often work late to develop photographs or prepare for the next day's sessions. Mr. Blackwood trusted me completely with the technical aspects of the business. She hesitated again, then continued. The main studio was dark, but I could see light coming from under the darkroom door. That wasn't unusual. Mr. Blackwood often worked late into the night, especially when he was developing photographs that required special handling. Special handling, another euphemism that suggested Blackwood's work involved more than simple portrait photography. What sort of photographs required special handling, Miss Hartwell? She looked directly at me for the first time since we'd begun talking, and I could see the internal struggle between loyalty to her dead employer and the need to tell the truth to the police. Mr. Blackwood was discreet about certain aspects of his work, Inspector. Not all of his photographs were intended for public display. Sometimes people would come to him with specific requests, documentation of certain events, evidence of certain indiscretions. He considered himself a professional, regardless of the subject matter. In other words, Blackwood had been engaged in what could only be described as blackmail photography, capturing images that his subjects desperately wanted to keep private, then presumably selling his discretion for substantial sums. It was a dangerous game, one that provided clear motives for murder and explained the nervous behavior Miss Hartwell had observed. When you found the dark-room door open and discovered Mr. Blackwood's body, did you notice anything unusual about the scene, anything missing or out of place? That's just it, Inspector. Everything seemed normal, except for poor Mr. Blackwood. The chemicals were mixed properly, the equipment was arranged as always, the photographs from this evening's session were developing in the fixing bath, exactly as they should be. Blackwood himself was holding a different camera. Yes, that was strange. He was holding his personal Leica, the one he used for candid photography, not studio work, and the flash reflector was positioned as if he'd just taken a picture, but there was no subject visible in the room. Plus, she paused, looking troubled, plus what Miss Hartwell, plus he was holding it in his right hand. Mr. Blackwood was left-handed, Inspector. In all the years I worked with him, I never saw him operate a camera with his right hand. It would have been completely unnatural for him. This confirmed Mills's observation and added another layer of complexity to the scene. Either Blackwood had been forced to hold the camera in his non-dominant hand for some reason, or someone else had placed it there after his death. Stop and think about what we know so far. A left-handed photographer found dead holding a camera in his right hand, the final photograph taken at the moment of death, but no visible subject in the room. Someone else's fingerprints on the camera, and a victim who had been receiving threatening calls from an unknown blackmailer. What could that final photograph reveal? A killer caught in the act, or something even more mysterious? If you're following this intricate mystery, don't forget to subscribe for daily detective stories that challenge your deductive skills. Leave a comment with your theory. What do you think that final photograph will show us? Now, let's develop that crucial image and see what secrets it holds. The Miss Hartwell, I said, I need you to help us develop that final photograph. Your expertise could be crucial to solving this case, and I suspect Mr. Blackwood would have wanted his professional standards maintained even in death. She nodded, though I could see the reluctance in her eyes. Developing the final image captured by her murdered employer would be deeply unsettling, but it was necessary for the investigation. More than that, I sensed that she felt a professional obligation to handle Blackwood's final work with the same care and attention that had made his studio famous. We returned to the dark room, where Mills had carefully removed the exposed plate from Blackwood's camera and placed it in the developing tray. The process of developing a photograph in 1925 required patience and precision. The exposed plate had to be immersed in developing solution for exactly the right amount of time, then transferred to a stop bath to halt the chemical reaction, and finally placed in fixing solution to make the image permanent. Miss Hartwell worked with practiced efficiency despite her emotional state, her movements automatic from years of experience. The exposure was taken with flash powder, she explained as she adjusted the developing solution. That means we should get a very clear image, even in the dark room's low light. Mr. Blackwood always used the finest quality flash powder. He said that if you were going to capture a moment in time, you owed it to that moment to capture it perfectly. We waited in tense silence as the chemicals worked their magic, the red safety lamp casting everything in an otherworldly glow. Gradually, an image began to emerge on the photographic plate, shadows becoming shapes, shapes becoming recognizable forms, reality slowly materializing from the chemical soup like a ghost taking physical form. What we saw defied all logic and expectation. The photograph showed the dark room itself, taken from Blackwood's position near the developing tables, but instead of revealing a murderer caught in the act, the image showed something impossible. The dark room appeared to be completely empty, except for Blackwood himself, visible as a reflection in the large mirror that hung on the far wall. But that can't be right, Mills muttered, leaning closer to examine the developed plate. If Mr. Blackwood was taking a photograph at the moment he was shot, surely the killer would be visible in the image. The Miss Hartwell studied the photograph with professional attention to detail, her brow furrowed with concentration. The flash illumination is correct for the distance and angle, she said slowly. This image hasn't been manipulated or altered in any way. It shows exactly what was in the camera's field of view at the moment the shutter was released. An impossible photograph of an empty room, taken at the moment of murder. Either we were dealing with a killer who could somehow make himself invisible, or there was something fundamentally wrong with our understanding of what had occurred in this dark room. I examined the photograph more carefully, using the magnifying glass that Blackwood kept for detailed print inspection. The image was indeed crystal clear, the flash illumination revealing every detail of the dark room's interior. Chemical bottles lined the shelves in perfect order, developing trays sat in their proper positions, and the various pieces of darkroom equipment were clearly visible in their usual locations. But there was something else, something that Miss Hartwell's trained eye had missed in her initial shock. In the lower right corner of the image, partially obscured by the developing table, was a shadow that didn't match any of the room's normal equipment. It was too angular, too sharp-edged to be cast by the rounded bottles and curved surfaces that filled the dark room. Mills, I said quietly, pointing to the anomaly, look at this shadow pattern. Does it seem consistent with the rest of the room's lighting? He studied the area I indicated, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. It's too geometric, sir. Everything else in the room casts soft shadows from the flash illumination, but this area shows sharp straight lines, almost as if something large and flat was positioned in the room, but isn't visible in the photograph itself. I finished, which suggests that something was present in the room that's not shown in the photograph, something that was removed between the moment the photograph was taken and the moment we arrived. But how could something cast a shadow without being visible in the image? The only explanation was that the object had been removed immediately after the photograph was taken, removed by the killer before fleeing the scene. Miss Hartwell, I said, I need you to think carefully about the dark room's normal layout. Is there anything missing from this photograph that should be present? She studied the image intently, comparing it to her mental map of the room's usual arrangement. Her knowledge of the studio's every detail was clearly encyclopedic, the result of years of working in this space and maintaining its equipment. The folding screen, she said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of certainty. Mr. Blackwood kept a large folding screen in that corner. He used it to block stray light from the door when he was working with particularly sensitive materials. It should be visible in this photograph, but it's not there. A folding screen large enough to conceal a person moved after the murder to eliminate evidence of the killer's presence. But that still didn't explain how the murderer had managed to shoot Blackwood while remaining outside the camera's field of view, or why they had taken the risk of moving evidence after committing the crime. I returned to the dark room and examined the corner where the screen would normally stand. The floor showed clear impressions where the screen's legs had rested for months or possibly years, and there were slight scuff marks, suggesting it had been moved recently. The dust patterns on the floor told their own story. The screen had been a permanent fixture until very recently, but moved where? The answer lay in the main studio, behind one of Blackwood's larger cameras. I found the folding screen, hastily repositioned, but not quite concealing the marks on the floor where it had been dragged. The killer had indeed hidden behind the screen, then moved it after the murder to confuse the investigation. Think about this carefully. Why would a killer move evidence after committing murder? Most criminals flee as quickly as possible, but this murderer took the time to rearrange the crime scene. That suggests either remarkable cool-headedness or that moving the screen was essential to their escape plan. But how does hiding behind a screen solve the problem of shooting someone while remaining invisible to a camera? But there was still the fundamental problem of the impossible angle. If the killer had been concealed behind the screen in the corner of the dark room, how had they managed to shoot Blackwood from the front while remaining outside the camera's view? The angles simply didn't work. Anyone firing from that position should have been clearly visible in the photograph. The solution came to me as I studied the arrangement of mirrors that Blackwood used to adjust lighting for his photographs. The darkroom contained several reflective surfaces, not just the large mirror on the far wall that was visible in the photograph. There were smaller mirrors positioned at strategic angles to direct light and allow the photographer to monitor his work from different positions without moving around the cramped space. One of these mirrors, a small, adjustable mirror mounted on a flexible arm, had been positioned at an unusual angle, tilted so that someone standing behind the folding screen could see Blackwood's position near the developing tables. More importantly, they could aim a weapon using the mirror's reflection without exposing themselves to the camera's direct view. The murderer had used Blackwood's own professional equipment against him, turning the photographer's tools into instruments of deception and death. They had positioned themselves behind the screen, adjusted the mirror to get a clear shot, and fired at the reflection while Blackwood was taking his final photograph. But this level of sophistication suggested intimate knowledge of the darkroom's layout and equipment. The killer wasn't a stranger who had broken in randomly. They were someone familiar with Blackwood's work methods and studio arrangement. "Miss Hartwell," I said, returning to where she waited in the main studio, "who else has access to this building? Who would be familiar enough with Mr. Blackwood's equipment to use it in the way we've just discovered?" She considered the question carefully, her expression growing more troubled. "Very few people, Inspector. Mr. Blackwood was quite particular about security. Besides myself, there's the cleaning woman who comes twice a week, but she's never allowed in the darkroom. Then there are his regular clients, but they only see the main studio during their sessions. What about former employees? Anyone who might have worked here in the past and retained knowledge of the layout?" "There was someone," she said slowly, "Mr. Blackwood's previous assistant, Marcus Webb. He worked here for nearly 3 years before I was hired, but he left under difficult circumstances. What sort of circumstances? Mr. Blackwood discovered that Marcus had been making unauthorized copies of certain photographs, sensitive photographs that were meant to remain strictly confidential. There was a terrible row, accusations of theft and betrayal. Mr. Blackwood dismissed him immediately and threatened to have him prosecuted if he ever revealed what he'd seen during his employment. Marcus Webb, a former employee with intimate knowledge of the studio, access to sensitive photographs, and a motive for revenge against his former employer. This was exactly the kind of lead that could break a case wide open. Do you know where Mr. Webb is now? What he's been doing since leaving Mr. Blackwood's employ? I heard he opened his own studio in Bloomsbury, specializing in, well, let's say less reputable forms of photography. But Inspector, there's something else you should know about Marcus. He was trained by Mr. Blackwood himself. He knows every piece of equipment in this studio, every technique and method. If anyone could have devised the sort of elaborate plan you've described, it would be Marcus Webb. But even as Miss Hartwell spoke, I realized that our case was more complicated than a simple revenge killing by a disgruntled former employee. The sophisticated method used to kill Blackwood, the careful positioning of mirrors, the knowledge of camera angles and photographic technique, the manipulation of evidence after the murder, suggested a level of planning and forethought that went beyond personal animosity. Someone had orchestrated these events with remarkable precision, using multiple people and multiple pieces of evidence to create a mystery that would confuse and misdirect the investigation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the power of photographic evidence and the deductive capabilities of an experienced detective.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. As Mills and I prepared to leave the studio to track down Marcus Webb, Miss Hartwell made a confession that changed everything about our understanding of the case. "Inspector," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hiss of the gas lights, "there's something else you need to know about tonight." I wasn't entirely truthful about why I came to the studio so late. I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be crucial to solving the case. In my experience, when witnesses decided to amend their initial statements, it usually meant they had been protecting someone or something, and that protection was no longer worth maintaining. I received a telephone call earlier this evening, someone asking me to meet them at the studio at midnight. They said it was urgent, that it concerned Mr. Blackwood's safety. Who made this call? They wouldn't give their name, but the voice was educated, aristocratic, a woman's voice, but disguised somehow, as if she was trying to alter her natural speaking tone. She said that Mr. Blackwood was in danger, and that I was the only person who could help prevent something terrible from happening. A mysterious telephone call, luring Miss Hartwell to the studio at the very time when Blackwood was murdered. Either she was being manipulated as an unwitting accomplice, or she was lying about her involvement in the crime. That her obvious distress and the detail about the disguised voice suggested that she was indeed an innocent pawn in someone else's game. "Miss Hartwell," I said carefully, "I need you to think very carefully about everything that happened tonight. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem?" She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a small piece of paper. When I arrived at the studio, this was pinned to the front door. The note was written on expensive stationery in an elegant feminine hand. "The truth is in the shadows. Look for what isn't there. Time is running out for those who profit from others' shame." A cryptic message that could have been written by the killer or by someone trying to help the investigation, but combined with the anonymous telephone call, it suggested a level of planning and forethought that went far beyond a simple crime of passion. I was beginning to suspect that we were dealing with something much more complex than a straightforward blackmail murder. Someone had orchestrated events with remarkable precision, using Miss Hartwell as an unwitting witness,
and manipulating the scene to create a mystery that would confuse and misdirect the investigation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the power of photographic evidence and the deductive capabilities of an experienced detective who had spent decades learning to read the stories that crime scenes told. Consider this. Someone lured Miss Hartwell to the studio at exactly the right time to discover the body. Someone left a cryptic note about looking for what isn't there. Someone manipulated physical evidence with the skill of a professional photographer. This isn't random violence. This is a carefully orchestrated plan, but planned by whom and why? Why? The solution was beginning to take shape in my mind, but I needed more evidence before I could be certain of my conclusions. The case hinged on understanding not just who had killed Reginald Blackwood, but why they had gone to such elaborate lengths to disguise their method and confuse the investigation. Miss Hartwell, I said, I need to examine Mr. Blackwood's business files, particularly any records he might have kept of his more sensitive photographic work. Where would such records be stored? She led me to Blackwood's private office, a smaller room adjacent to the main studio where he conducted the business side of his operation. The space was elegantly appointed, but clearly functional. A large desk covered with appointment books and correspondence, filing cabinets filled with client records, and a safe built into the wall behind a portrait of Queen Victoria. Mr. Blackwood kept meticulous records, Miss Hartwell explained as she produced a key ring from her employer's personal effects. He said that in his line of work, documentation was essential for protecting both himself and his clients. The files were indeed meticulous, organized by date and client name, with detailed notes about each session, payment received, and photographs delivered. But it was the locked filing cabinet in the corner that held the most interesting material, what Blackwood had euphemistically labeled his special collections. Miss Hartwell's hands trembled as she unlocked the cabinet. I was never allowed to handle these files, she admitted. Mr. Blackwood said they contained material that was too sensitive for anyone else to see. He always processed these photographs himself, often working through the night to ensure complete privacy. The files inside told a story of systematic blackmail spanning nearly a decade. Photographs of prominent politicians in compromising situations, images of society hostesses engaged in extramarital affairs, documentation of financial irregularities involving members of parliament and titled aristocrats. Each file contained not just the photographs themselves, but detailed records of the payments Blackwood had received for his discretion, amounts that would have made him wealthy beyond the dreams of most professional photographers. But it was the most recent file that proved most relevant to our investigation. Labeled simply Project Pemberton, it contained photographs that would have destroyed one of London's most powerful families if they had ever been made public. Lord Pemberton was a senior member of the Conservative Party, a man whose political influence extended throughout the government and whose social connections included members of the royal family itself. His wife, Lady Margaret Pemberton, was a leading figure in London society, known for her charity work and her patronage of the arts. Their daughter, Victoria, was one of the season's most eligible debutantes, expected to make a brilliant marriage that would further cement the family's social position. But the photographs in Blackwood's secret file told a dramatically different story. Lady Pemberton, photographed at various locations throughout London, meeting secretly with a man who was definitely not her husband. The images were artfully composed and devastatingly clear. There could be no mistaking either the identities of the people involved or the intimate nature of their relationship. More damaging still were the photographs showing Lord Pemberton himself engaged in activities that would have scandalized his conservative supporters and probably ended his political career permanently. Blackwood had been systematic in documenting the secret lives of both husband and wife, building a collection of evidence that could destroy their family's reputation, political influence, and social standing in a single afternoon. The most recent entry in the file was dated just 3 days before Blackwood's murder, a record of a meeting with Lady Pemberton herself, accompanied by a demand for £15,000 in exchange for the original photographs and all negatives. £15,000 was an enormous sum, enough to purchase several substantial houses in fashionable London neighbourhoods. But for the Pembertons, with their vast estates and political connections, it would have seemed a reasonable price to pay for preserving their carefully constructed public image. "Miss Hartwell," I said, closing the file with grim satisfaction, "I believe we've found our motive. The question now is whether Lady Pemberton decided to pay Blackwood's price or eliminate the problem permanently." But even as I spoke, I realized that the case was more complicated than a simple blackmail murder. The sophisticated method used to kill Blackwood, the careful positioning of mirrors, the knowledge of camera angles and photographic technique, the manipulation of evidence after the murder, suggested a killer with intimate knowledge of photography and darkroom procedures. Lady Pemberton was certainly intelligent enough to devise such a plan, and as a regular client of the studio, she would have had opportunities to observe Blackwood's working methods. But did she have the technical knowledge to execute such an elaborate scheme? More importantly, did she have the nerve to carry out a plan that required her to remain in the studio for several minutes after committing murder? Here's what troubles me. Lady Pemberton had the motive, and possibly the opportunity, but did she have the expertise? Remember, someone moved that folding screen, adjusted the mirrors, positioned the camera in Blackwood's dead hand, and then left a cryptic note while making an anonymous phone call. This killer didn't just want Blackwood dead, they wanted to create a puzzle that would baffle the police. Why? The answer came from the most unexpected source. As Mills and I prepared to pay a visit to the Pemberton residence in Belgravia, Miss Hartwell revealed one final piece of information that transformed our understanding of the entire case. "Inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I should have mentioned earlier about the telephone call I received tonight. The woman who called me, when she spoke about Mr. Blackwood being in danger, she mentioned something specific. She said that the photographer's last shot would reveal more than he intended." The photographer's last shot, the exact phrase, suggested that the caller knew not only that Blackwood would be murdered, but that he would be found with a camera in his hands. This level of specific knowledge could only come from someone intimately involved in planning the crime. Did she say anything else? She mentioned that I should look for evidence of previous deceits when I developed the final photograph. At the time, I thought she was speaking metaphorically, but now it seemed clear that the anonymous caller had been trying to direct our investigation towards specific evidence. But evidence of what? And why would the killer want us to discover proof of their crime? Unless the person who made the call wasn't the killer at all, but someone who knew about the murder plan and was trying to ensure that justice was served without directly implicating themselves. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was far more complex than I had initially imagined. We weren't dealing with a single murderer acting alone, but with a conspiracy involving multiple parties, each with their own motives and methods. "Miss Hartwell," I said, "I need you to think carefully about everyone who has visited the studio in recent weeks, anyone who might have had access to observe Mr. Blackwood's working methods, or learn about his security procedures." She considered the question for several minutes, clearly reviewing her mental catalogue of recent clients and visitors. "There have been many people, Inspector. Society photography requires constant interaction with clients and their associates, but there was one visitor who seemed particularly interested in the technical aspects of the work." "Who was that?" "Marcus Webb, Mr. Blackwood's former assistant. He came by about 2 weeks ago claiming he wanted to apologize for their past difficulties and possibly discuss future collaboration. Mr. Blackwood was suspicious, but he agreed to see him privately." Marcus Webb, again, the disgruntled former employee, who knew all of Blackwood's methods and had been dismissed for stealing sensitive photographs. But if Webb was involved, why would he have called Miss Hartwell to ensure that the body was discovered quickly? The answer struck me with sudden clarity. Webb hadn't called Miss Hartwell, Lady Pemberton had. But Lady Pemberton wasn't the killer either. She was being framed by someone who wanted both Blackwood dead and the Pemberton family destroyed. The real murderer was someone with access to both the studio and the Pemberton blackmail files, someone with the technical knowledge to stage an elaborate deception, and someone with a motive that encompassed more than simple revenge or financial gain. Marcus Webb had indeed killed Reginald Blackwood, but not for the reasons we had initially assumed. Webb had been working as an agent for a competitor, systematically undermining Blackwood's business by stealing his techniques and his clients. The murder was meant to eliminate Blackwood while framing Lady Pemberton for the crime, destroying two targets with a single brilliant plan.
But Webb had made one crucial error in his elaborate scheme. In his eagerness to implicate Lady Pemberton, he had left too many clues pointing toward his own involvement. The adjusted mirror, the moved screen, the telephone call to Miss Hartwell, each element of his plan contained evidence that could be traced back to him. We found Webb at his Bloomsbury studio the following morning, still developing photographs that he had stolen from Blackwood's files during his recent visit. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, he confessed to the murder, though he continued to insist that he had been justified in eliminating a man who had built his fortune on other people's secrets. The trial became a sensation in London society, exposing not only the sordid world of blackmail photography, but also the elaborate lengths to which people would go to protect their reputations. Webb was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Lady Pemberton, though cleared of any involvement in the murder, found herself ruined by the revelation of Blackwood's blackmail files. The photographs that had cost one man his life ultimately destroyed her family's social standing anyway, proving that some secrets cannot be kept forever, no matter what price is paid for silence. Miss Hartwell inherited Blackwood's legitimate photography business and transformed it into one of London's most respected portrait studios. She wisely avoided the more questionable aspects of her former employer's work, proving that talent and integrity could succeed where blackmail and deception had ultimately failed. Before I conclude this case, I want you to consider something. How many times in your own life have you seen a photograph and assumed you understood exactly what it showed? How often do we trust our eyes completely, without questioning whether we're seeing the whole truth? As this case taught me, even the most honest camera can lie when operated by dishonest hands. The case taught me several important lessons about the relationship between technology and crime. As our tools become more sophisticated, so do the methods used by those who would exploit them for illegal purposes. Webb's elaborate plan showed how photography could be used not just to capture truth, but to create convincing lies that could deceive even experienced investigators. But the same technology that enables new forms of crime also provides new ways to solve them, if we're clever enough to understand and use the evidence it provides. The shadows in Blackwood's final photograph, the fingerprints on the camera, the subtle clues in the crime scene arrangement, all of these details told a story that eventually led us to the truth, despite the killer's best efforts to misdirect our investigation. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated that in the modern age of mass communication and social mobility, reputation has become both more valuable and more fragile than ever before. The same newspapers and magazines that can make someone famous overnight can also destroy them just as quickly. In that environment, the power to create or destroy reputations becomes a weapon as dangerous as any gun or knife. Reginald Blackwood had understood this power and had used it ruthlessly to enrich himself at the expense of others. But in the end, he discovered that those who live by secrets often die by them as well. His carefully constructed web of blackmail and deception ultimately trapped him as surely as it had trapped his victims. Marcus Webb, driven by professional jealousy and personal resentment, had thought he could use Blackwood's own methods against him. But Webb lacked his former employer's patience and subtlety.
Where Blackwood had been content to profit slowly and steadily from his victims' secrets, Webb had wanted immediate revenge and dramatic results. That impatience ultimately led to his downfall, and that, my friends, was how we solved the case of the photographer's last shot, a murder that seemed impossible until we understood that the evidence itself had been carefully manipulated, turning photography from a tool of truth into an instrument of deception. Marcus Webb's elaborate plan nearly succeeded, but he forgot that every crime scene tells a story, and sometimes that story reveals more than the criminal ever intended. The case demonstrated that in our modern age of technology and innovation, criminals are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their methods. They understand that success depends not just on committing the perfect crime, but on creating the perfect deception to hide it. But fortunately for justice, the same tools they use to commit and conceal their crimes can also be turned against them by investigators who understand how to read the evidence properly. What did you think of today's mystery? Did you suspect Marcus Webb from the beginning, or were you convinced that Lady Pemberton was our killer? Could you have solved the case before Inspector Hartley revealed the truth about the mirror trick and the planted evidence? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing your theories and deductions, and I'm particularly curious about which clues you found most convincing. Most importantly, what did this case teach you about the nature of evidence itself? How do we distinguish between what something appears to show and what it actually reveals? In an age where photographs can be manipulated and staged, how do we determine what's real and what's constructed? These are questions that investigators face every day, and they're becoming more complex as technology advances. Don't forget to subscribe to Detective Stories audiobooks for a new mystery every single day. Tomorrow we'll be investigating a case that takes us into the mysterious world of London's antiquarian book dealers, where a rare manuscript holds the key to murder and a secret that has been hidden for centuries. It's a story that will show you how the written word can be just as dangerous as any weapon, and how knowledge itself can become a motive for the deadliest crimes. Until then, remember to question what you see and trust what you can prove. In the world of detective fiction, and in real life, nothing is ever quite what it appears to be at first glance. The truth is always there, waiting to be discovered, but it takes patience, skill, and careful observation to separate fact from fiction. This has been Detective Stories audiobooks, where every story teaches us something new about the art of detection and the nature of human deception. Subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow for another case that will test your powers of observation and challenge your assumptions about the nature of evidence itself. Remember, in the shadows of every crime, the truth is waiting. You just have to know how to look for it.